Hi, this is Progressive Christianity 101. I'm Maggie Wolford, student pastor at Central United Methodist Church in Endicott, New York, and I'm joined by our lead pastor today.
I'm Michelle Bogue-Trost. They call me Pastor Michelle around here.
So, you are the lead pastor at Central and a woman.
Yes.
These are things that growing up I was not told were options. So growing up in an evangelical home, I was told, women should be silent in church. They can lead other women and they can lead children, but there is this biblically prescribed hierarchy with God at the head, below that the husband, the man, and then below that the wife or kids, depending on who you're talking to, and then the other, and that men should be the spiritual leaders, not only in your individual household, but in your community as well.
Right.
And so meeting you and finding a female pastor, blew all of that up for me. So how did we get here?
Well, we get there from biblical tradition, not just letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, but throughout the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, there have been women prophets and women judges and women seers and visionaries. When you get to the New Testament, women are commissioned by Jesus to be part of the disciples. They are part of the ministry, part of the movement. They're the first ones to see and proclaim the resurrection. After the resurrection, you've got the first Gentile convert in Europe was a woman who was tutored by Paul. So there are all sorts of examples all through scriptures about women in leadership, and particularly religious and spiritual leadership.
So is this a situation where the answer is just patriarchy as to why we forgot that and got to...
It certainly is.
So, you're talking about all these incredible women from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and, my problem had been that I just didn't grow up hearing those stories, or if I did, I heard them in a very different way.
You didn't hear them celebrated or affirmed as powerful women in Scripture.
And that caused so many issues for me, especially as, the sort of half-joking, half-not story is that as a kindergartner, they were like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's like, I'm going to be a pastor like my dad. And all of the people in my life, my kindergarten teacher, my parents, sitting me down and being like, so here's why you can't do that. And I, you're a young child. You just take that as, oh, absolutely. Okay. Thanks, Mom and Dad. And then as I got older, constantly being told you can do anything that the boys or men in your life can do, except when it comes to church. Mm-hmm. Every other sector, I was supposed to be expecting equality. But this is a place where oh no, but of course this is God's natural order of things.
That is troubling. It's troubling because it's ingrained in so many cultural pieces, particularly in evangelical fundamentalist circles. It leaks over into the culture as well. It's troubling because it's not just, from olden days. It's still there, very much present, and painful. We've talked a lot about sort of your family's response to your living into this call being a painful experience. It's painful because for me, I'm sort of a third generation clergy woman. And the women coming after me are still having the same problems. We're still having troubles in churches that we get appointed to with folks saying, well, okay, we'll take her for a little while, but we need a real pastor soon, right? That real pastor is still used many times. Mm-hmm. We have folks in churches who absolutely categorically refuse to accept a woman pastor, which they can't do, but cabinets and bishops aren't going to put pastors in where they're going to get chewed up. So you get this perpetuating thing because of these assumptions about who women are in the scheme of God's program. Mm-hmm. And it's painful to watch. It's painful to be part of.
one of the things you talked a little bit about, that tradition that we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I guess the primary question is, what is the biblical role of women?
So women in the Bible run the gamut, from silent partners to innocent victims to unnamed prostitutes and horrible sinning women, to Jezebel, the worst woman of all. And you've got this whole tapestry of women through Scripture that mingle in with Miriam, Moses' sister, who is revered as a prophet. You've got Rahab, the prostitute, who helps the people of Moses cross over into the Canaan, in the Promised Land.
I mean, I think, the most famous woman of the Bible is certainly Mary, mother of Jesus.
So Mary is a contrast, depending on who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. And you've got all these Marys through the New Testament scriptures. You've got this Mary. You've got Mary Magdalene, who, depending on who you're talking to, is a prostitute, which is not and never was and never will be true. It doesn't say it anywhere in the scripture. But you've got this woman who has been vilified, yet you've got these extra canonical gospels that celebrate Mary Magdalene and her place in the disciples, that of course was left out of canon. So there's a whole lot of, we talked in one of these conversations about whitewashing Jesus, but this is male washing Scripture. So this is patriarchy. This is the promulgation of the idea that men are superior, using picked and chosen texts from all through the Jewish and Christian scriptures to justify men being in charge and male authority as being real authority because Jesus is male. And of course, by definition, in that worldview, God is male.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, even just the idea of, Jesus as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. I mean,
Right.
we're constantly putting things in gendered terms, and there's a lot of assumptions made there. If, it's not as if you would say, like, we, the church, are at the same level as Jesus. Like, that would be blasphemy. But therefore, sort of the implied connection there is that, of course, the husband is over the wife.
And if you look through a number of letters falsely attributed to Paul in the New Testament, you'll hear that too. And you can pick out those verses and you can absolutely justify that kind of conversation and that kind of role solidification. Mm-hmm. What that does is hurt people. It says to half the population of the entire world that you are not worth as much. It says to half of the entire world that God can call you to some things but not others, while God could call men to anything. It reduces the role of half the people in the world to subservience. And from that focal point comes oppression, mistreatment, abuse of women in God's name. Mm-hmm. And it's wrong.
I don't think you can talk about women in the Judeo-Christian texts without acknowledging, I mean, there are some intense passages that you can pull out and kind of cherry pick, either to say that women should be subservient, but also to point to a very, literal monetary worth of women. Certain, I'll say, Christian traditions don't seem to want to let some of that go. There is a huge premium put on, female purity. Start talking to women and girls at very young ages about, the value that you carry and how you're going to be giving this gift to your husband on your wedding night and all those things. And it just puts such a premium on that piece of women. It says nothing about their intelligence or their insights or the things that they can bring to the table for others to learn from.
yes, a woman's worth is placed on a biological function or on the purity she carries innately, and that's a wonderful way to put women up on pedestals and for people to argue that they are revering women with this, right? That they are putting extraordinary value on women, without ever asking, why are we not trying to put the same value or not value on men? We don't ask the other side of the question. And there are scriptures that they pull out and say, well, this establishes that role, or this establishes that precedent. Yet there's scriptures throughout the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament that honor, cherish, and uphold slavery. Mm-hmm. We seem to have gotten over that as a norm. So why is it that the valuation of women on purity or behavior has continued to be held up as a good? You've got that scripture, that story of the woman taken in adultery, right? They're gonna stone her, and Jesus says, "Let those without sin cast the first stone." Well, if she's taken in adultery, that means caught in the act. That means there's a man with her at the time. He is never mentioned. Mm-hmm. There is no, one of the 10 Commandments is you do not covet your neighbor's wife, right? You do not sin with lust. So where's his penalty? Where's the consequences for his breaking one of the big 10? It's her that's cast in doubt. It's her that's assumed guilty. It's her that's punished.
Yeah.
Or tried to be punished.
And that is absolutely carried through unto today. I don't think you have to look very hard to find multiple stories from the news or just from women in your own life, if you have conversations with them about this, how, if you hear that a woman was assaulted, one of the first things people will say is, what was she wearing?
Yeah.
And it's like, who cares? There is still this idea that women, and again, that priority on their purity and their value associated with that, and that they are also responsible for safeguarding it. If anything happens to soil that purity in the woman from no fault of her own, she is still the one whom that blame is hung on.
Right. And it comes to a deeper question that rarely gets asked, which is who gave who authority or power to assign value to personhood? Who gets to decide what someone is worth, monetarily or metaphorically, or physically? At what point did humanity decide we can claim that authority? And at what point was that authority misappropriated and amplified to favor one over another?
Yeah.
And now, today, when we're talking about gender being so fluid, and we're understanding that gender identity is a map. There's no line anymore. There's no spectrum of identity. It's all over the place. So, as people understand and put words to their own physical identities, where does all the scripture that even delineates between men and women and their worth and value, how do you even bring that into the conversation? Mm-hmm. Because when you've set it up as a polarity and you've bulked it up with scripture to make your argument, foolproof, mm-hmm. How do you even, and we see it, we're seeing it in the religious right, in the fundamentalist quarter, in the evangelical circles, that gender identity, we don't want to talk about it because we are so in this men-women polarity. Mm-hmm. You can't break that, because then all your scriptural substructure falls apart for it.
Well, you raise a good point as well about the binary, that there are, I'm thinking about the passage attributed to Paul about neither Jew nor Gentile, neither male nor female, neither slave nor free. And in most Christian circles, we're not saying like, yes, the Jewish followers of Jesus are by far the more superior versus the Gentiles. But then so many Christian circles, especially as you mentioned, the religious right and evangelicals and, fundamentalists, that binary, that division is one that they are just not going to let go of.
When you use Scripture to build patriarchal structures, when you use Scripture to build oppressive structures or power structures, you absolutely cannot have those challenged, because then your whole scriptural foundation falls away. And where's your faith then?
And I'm just delighted how many women I see in my Master of Divinity courses and in my professorship and all those things, but not a single one of them doesn't have a story of someone telling them, no, you can't do this because you're a woman, or, well, what does your husband think about that, or whatever. And it is still very much present with us today.
It is even beyond institutionally. In the United Methodist Church, women weren't ordained until 1956. That's not a great story. In individual churches, whether or not the leadership of a church says, sure, a woman pastor, great, fine. I've been the first woman pastor in several of my appointments. But it's the micro stuff, right? It's the I have to wear a collar to a funeral because I spend way too much time having to explain to people that I really am the pastor here to officiate at this service for your dearly departed. I used to, when I was a lot younger, really felt the necessity of wearing a collar to hospital visits for the same reason. Now I seem to be pulling it off. Some of the wrinkles help. But it shouldn't be that way, right? And I've had more than one, drunk relative at a wedding reception say to me along the lines of, well, if pastors all look like you, I'd be in church every week. It's just this kind of mess that we're still dealing with on micro levels, even as the macro levels might look like they're getting better. The micro levels are not. And there are still structures and systems in place that were designed to keep women and men separate in ministry. And there are more or less enlightened leaders in our denomination.
I feel very fortunate to have found a female pastor that I could ask these questions of, and who could give me resources, and who could, sort of acknowledge my call within me even before I was totally willing to acknowledge it. But just for other people who are still kind of, struggling with some of this, or are unsure how to reconcile the idea of women in leadership, or who just want to be seeking out more female voices, do you have any recommendations?
Oh, so many. I've always loved Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's books, but she said, and in memory of her, and I think those are really readable places to start. There's a lot of scholarship on women in the Bible, and I think even in the last 25 years, there's been a lot more, and I'm not familiar with all of it. You would be more familiar with that.
The two that really stuck out to me from readings I've done in my classes, I just wrote them down because I knew I wouldn't remember. Feminist theologians Rosemary Radford Ruther.
Classic.
Yeah, so good. And then also 𝘾𝙀𝙏𝙁, who also brings in some intersectionality with, again, like some Asian perspective and trying to get away from some of the Eurocentrist stuff.
I think with your mentioning those two in particular, it's important to say here that there's a lot of work done in various female contexts. Classic Euro-Western women, but womanist theology, black women's theology, mujerista theology, the Hispanic woman's experience. and spirituality. We can't look at one and not look at the rest. Because for too long, even that class, women, has been lumped together without any sort of cultural or experiential differences noted. We've sort of whitewashed the experience of women in Scripture and in faith. And it's important not to keep doing that.
But honestly, I have also really loved spiritual growth content that's been written by women. So I had someone gift me just a book of prayers that were written by women, and it is so incredibly obvious that they're written by women because they are speaking from firsthand experience of having walked through various situations. All right, till next time. Bye.
Bye.